So industry needs finance. And the reason it's so important for us to understand that is some people think that there might be a split between finance and industry and we cannot lie ourselves with manufacturing against finance. Well, that won't happen. They're integrated. They depend on each other. And part of our analysis has to be to recognize that won't happen. We're fighting them both. The other thing is that people also need finance. This is the thing we also have to recognize, which adds a complexity to it. So when the crisis hit, Michael Moore put out a call to people to go out in the streets and oppose the bailout. And a lot of people went in the streets, and tens of thousands actually wrote to their congressman not to support the bailout. 3 days later, it changed because people begin to figure out, I get my check through my bank. My pension depends on the stock market and finance. I'm selling my home, or I'm hoping, everything. We're completely dependent on it. So we don't actually have the luxury of simply saying, well, screw them. Let them go. I don't care if they go under. Well, the point is we're dependent on them. So again, it has strong political implications. It means that just kind of a populist response of screw them doesn't work. People will cheer you when you say it, but it doesn't work. So it does raise larger questions like we have to actually make them into a public utility. If they're treated like a public utility, when they're in trouble, we bail them out and it comes from our pocket. Why aren't they treated, why don't we make them into a public utility that's democratically run? And in fact, if we begin to talk about what we'd like to do in the economy, what other options there are, we'd keep coming back to, well, you'd have to control the banks. Otherwise, they don't like what you do, they won't lend you money, they'll leave the country, they'll screw up the economy. So the fact that finance is such a central player, but not an isolated player, that's what I'm trying to emphasize. It's part of the system, but it's so central to it, makes it a strategic question about actually getting this question on the agenda. Now, a lot of people will say, well, you can't talk about that, this is America. And we have to wait until there's more of an opening to talk about that. Well, if you don't talk about it, there's never going to be an opening. You have to raise this, even if it's not popular, and you have to build on it, and you have to do exactly what you said. You have to get people to begin to understand finance. And understanding finance doesn't just mean calling them parasites. It means actually understanding that they're, part of the problem with finance, with capitalism, is that capitalism needs this crazy thing in it. That's the problem with capitalism. And we have to be able to say that. And then we're serious. When I just hear people just saying finance is a speculative, get rid of them, that's good rhetoric. But when you're sober and you recognize, again, it gets back to recognizing how powerful the system is, then you say, well, this is a question of power. We got to figure out how to take them over. And finance is easier to think about in those terms because there's a lot of populist anger against finance. So, you begin to talk about, there's a sense of finance being a utility that makes the system work for everybody. So why don't we make it into a democratic utility so we can control it? Finance is, to do it abstractly, finance is like abstract capital because it moves, whereas industry is concrete capital. It's in a specific form. So the question of finance is really fundamental.
So let's talk about the elections. So the U.S. presidential elections are right around the corner. How might those elections impact the nature of the U.S. state or the role of the U.S. in managing global capitalism?
I'm not sure. I'll just give you my take. I need to think about this a little bit more. My sense of it is that whoever is president, their job description is that they're president of the world and they have to manage global capitalism. And they drift towards that. It becomes kind of nonpartisan. That Romney would move a bit more to the center, and Obama isn't going to move far to the left. So in terms of the American empire, I'm not sure that it would matter much. And you get this historically. You see this. You see Clinton, making critical comments about finance and then feeling like his hands are tied by finance, and then actually being the guy who does an awful lot to liberalize finance. And part of Clinton's getting rid of the deficit was to make finance happy, that they wouldn't have to, they'd feel more secure. Bush comes in and, his Paul O'Neill, his Treasury Secretary, is critical of all the interventions in solving crises, financial crises, that the previous administration made. and he won't do it. And Rubin actually says, the former Secretary Treasurer said, he'll say he won't do it, but he will. And sure enough, the crisis comes and they do it. So there are things that the state has to do to manage the system, and whoever is president is going to be within that. And the range of differences is minor. I think where the real differences come are around social issues, around the degree of inequality at home might be different, worse. Around affirmative action, around gender issues, around questions of racial equality, around gun control, etc. So I think on social issues, they're very important. And on the other hand, I do think what you have to say is the state can't always control this. So you may have Romney wanting to move to the center, but if you've in fact mobilized a Tea Party constituency and you win, and they therefore get a lot more confidence, and you bring a lot more right-wingers in as advisors into Washington, you can unleash a dynamic which moves to the right not just socially, but begins to become much more anti-Chinese, much more protectionism, and then begins to threaten the global economy. And I think, in fact, Wall Street business would put a lot of pressure against that, but those things happen. The opposition to globalization might actually come at some point from a fascist movement rather than from the left.
One of the major debates inside the election is around job creation in particular as a function of the economy.
Yeah.
Do you see any potential differences in how either candidate may impact that?
Yeah, Romney is very committed to using incentives and tax breaks for the corporations and his trickle-down theory. And that can't work in this kind of a crisis. Lower interest rates and tax incentives, they're like pushing on a string. Business is sitting there with tons of money, which nobody mentioned in the debate. Business has been very profitable. It's got tons of money, and it isn't investing. It doesn't need more money. The question is, it's not investing because it's not confident that things are going to change in the economy. And so the only thing that really will change it is massive stimulus. Massive stimulus that's direct. Massive stimulus in infrastructure. And the chances of Obama moving that direction are better than Romney. But I suspect that even if Romney were elected and his strategy doesn't work, and you get another downturn that's dangerous, that question would come up everywhere, even from finance, that we're all getting killed, people are getting angrier, and we have to do something. And the only thing that can ultimately get out of this crisis is massive expenditures in infrastructure. And it still remains to be seen whether Obama would have the confidence to do that, given the arguments around the deficit. And I think the critical point is how little pressure there is from below. That's still the critical thing. If there was the kind of pressure that there were in the 30s, we'd see this. There'd be an agreement that something has to be done to save capitalism.
What are the struggles or changes in the world that give you hope about the potential to move beyond capitalism?
Well, people always survive, and one of the dangers is they try to survive individually, but surviving individually, they learn, has its limits. You're either attacked collectively or you have to respond differently. So there's examples that you see that are impressive or exciting. You see indigenous people protesting and becoming a social force in certain countries in Latin America. In the States, you see particular examples of people organizing. Jobs with Justice, in pockets in Boston or in Portland, organizing around domestic workers, the work that Power is doing. The teachers thing is exciting because this was actually a group of teachers who fought their own national union and win and then pull off and show that they can actually mobilize the community. There's other public sector unions who become much more conscious of the fact that they actually need the public on their side, so they have to think about doing these things. The problem is that none of these things match what we're up against. So, they're hopeful in the sense that, okay, there's people who are ready to do something. They're hopeful in the sense that most people, unlike maybe the 50s or 60s, actually don't think the system is working great. Their problem is they don't think anything can be done about it. So the question still is, how do we develop a new layer of politics that goes beyond single issues or regionalized issues, local issues? And how do we even have that discussion? Because I don't even see that discussion taking place in a serious way. It's not taking place in Canada in a serious way, I think. And it's an interesting point, because in the 30s what happened is, the last time we had a crisis this deep, all kinds of movements exploded. Tenants taking over your homes, especially the labor movement. And the labor movement exploded with a new form of unionization. It moved from craft unions to industrial unions. It moved to having shop steward systems that put democracy into the workplace. It developed the tactic of the sit-down strike. And the question is, what form of working class organization might develop at this point? And so far, I don't think we've seen much discussion on that. One of the things that Occupy showed was that audacious action can touch a popular nerve, which is a great point, and that even a fairly crude way of talking about class could actually be put on the agenda, which politicians aren't doing. So again, it showed the potential. But I think the main thing that's going on is that people are unhappy. They haven't bought into the system. Their problem is fatalism. They just think that it can't be changed. And to get over that, partly you need some victories, but even the victories can only give you hope for a while. You'll get exhausted. You do it, and then kind of what? You need organization. We need some sense of people feeling like there are structures I can work through that can both help me and are part of building the capacities for future change. And that I'm part of a movement, that it's not just me fighting, in Chicago with the teachers, but there's people doing this everywhere. And we're going to learn from each other what works and what doesn't work. And we're going to be building our capacities. And it's just, it might take a while, but we know we're on a road to that. And that's the stage we haven't reached yet. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also very careful about, I don't think that these little bursts will add up to something unless we take advantage of that potential and build something larger.
Mm-hmm. So you've talked about making the banks a public utility as a transformative demand that can move us beyond capitalism at some point. Are there other demands that social movements can make on the U.S. state that could move us there?
Well, again, I think at this point, the way we should think about a lot of our demands are, they're demands that we're making, but we recognize we don't have the power to win them. So they're actually demands for organizing rather than for winning. We cannot win taking over the financial system right now. But raising it and getting people to understand why it's a necessary thing is part of building the capacity to do it. So the question is, what other things might we organize around? I think our demands we have to think about is what kinds of demands help build the capacities for future change. So, for example, one of the things we have to think about is conversion in the private sector. Let me put it differently. We talked about stimulus before, and I think that's good. We have to get out of this crisis. But if we get out of this crisis, we're just back to where we were in 2007. It's not a wonderful world. It's a world we used to criticize all the time back then. So it's going beyond the crisis. And if you want to go beyond the crisis, we have to change power. So one thing is conversion. Like one of the things that happens in the auto industry is we had hundreds of plants close in North America. Hundreds, if not, an incredible number of plants closed. These are all plants that could make things. These are all, what they're robbing us of is our productive potential. Instead of saying, let's save General Motors, we should have said, let's save the productive capacity. Instead of asking, how do we become more competitive again by lowering our wages, we should have said, how do we develop a plan that isn't based on profit, but it's based on solidarity and social use? And that would have led us to start talking about planning instead of competition, and social use instead of profits. And it would have led us to think about, well, why don't we convert things to the environment? If the environment is going to change everything over this next century, why aren't we talking about that? Why aren't we talking about what we need to build to change our infrastructure, to change transportation, to change offices, to change workplaces, to change homes, to change appliances? And what's powerful about that demand is it's giving you some independence from playing the game their way and just getting trapped into, we need subsidies. We don't like it, but we need it. And it begins, it gets you to start thinking in terms of your own independent values and what kind of society you'd like and what would be useful there, and getting other notions that are common sense on the agenda. So conversion is very important. For public sector unions, I think a crucial question, and this links to the social movements, is public sector unions have to see themselves as leaders in the defense of social services and public services. And if they don't do that, they're going to get killed, because they cannot go in and bargain with the state and win. The only way they can mobilize the public is if they get the public on their side. And that isn't going to happen through billboards and PR and convention documents. They're going to have to prove it. And the only way you can prove it is to do things like go into bargaining and say, bargaining is usually about what workers can get. We're not asking for anything. We want that social service expanded. That's our demand. We're ready to strike over a social service. Then you can mobilize the community. And then you're positioning yourself differently. And then you're beginning to think about a class perspective, which I think is critical to all of this. We have to develop a class perspective. We have to develop a perspective that goes beyond, I'm a woman, or I'm a black person, or I'm a member of a union. Because the problem in unions is they're sectional. They represent a particular group of workers. And that used to work in the 50s when you were strong, or 60s. You can represent your own members, you make some gains, maybe they'll spread to others. And often they did. It doesn't work anymore. Anybody who's strong enough to make gains for themselves, they'll make them for themselves. Nobody else will get them. They'll be resented. And next time they'll get killed. So this question of developing a class perspective on everything is important. The banks is about class power. Conversion is about, class needs. The public sector has to lead, including in its tactics, because it's always got this dilemma. If we strike, we hurt the public. So how can we say we're speaking for the public? Well, you have to think about strikes in a class way. In other words, we had a garbage strike in Toronto. One of the things that should have happened, people dropped their garbage off in parks. Everybody got mad, ruining your parks. Should have been dropped off in, your equivalent of, Bay Street, which is your equivalent of Wall Street, in their parking garages. They should have said, we're linking finance and the crisis. That's what we're doing. We got to think of those tactics. Postal workers in the past in Canada have gone on strike, but kept delivering welfare checks and pension checks. And the government actually was being hurt by it, so they made that illegal and told people to come to a warehouse to collect their checks and hope that the posties would picket and everybody be mad at the posties. Instead, the posties came with lawn chairs and coffee and donuts to hand out and say, we'd love to deliver this to your home, but the government won't let us. And so I think we can get pretty creative in thinking about what kind of tactics would we come up with if we're really thinking in class terms and building alliances that way.
Can you talk a bit about whether you think the question of an alternative vision is important? And then the second part of that is, what's your vision for an alternative vision to capitalism?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great and difficult question. I think there's a lot of difficult questions. One is vision. One is how we understand what's really wrong with capitalism, because there's not common understandings of that. Because some people, would like a fairer capitalism, in fact, when they're kind of anti-capitalist, or they'd like a capitalism without finance, or that didn't just have multinationals. And the other is, how do people who have been so screwed over by capitalism develop the capacity to change it? And I think all these questions are linked, and I think they're linked through the question of capacities. To me, the main criticism of capitalism is that it's fundamentally undemocratic because some people control the labor power of others. And when they're controlling that, what they're controlling is your creativity as a person and your ability to develop as a person. And when you sell labor power, so there's all kinds of markets and commodities in capitalism, but it's that labor is a commodity. Human activity is a commodity, is a fundamental problem. That some people control that and therefore distort it and limit how it develops. And when you think about it as capacities, they're robbing us of our capacities, even if they paid us better. So it's not just a question of getting paid better. It's that they're robbing us of our capacities. That begins to raise the question of, how do we develop the capacities? How do we get some independence from these guys so we can develop the capacities to change things? And you can only do that through struggle. So it's only when you're in struggle that you begin to find new capacities and you're developing new relationships. But one of the capacities you develop when you're in struggle is actually this vision question. When you just sit around, what happens with vision is it becomes a daydream. It becomes an escape from reality. I like to think about, it'd be nice if I could call up on the phone and get everything I wanted, for example. They become daydreams. They're not real. They're escapes. But when you're in struggle and you begin to think about, well, why is it this way? A trade union leader once said to me, when there's a strike, the workers on the picket line all become philosophers. They suddenly got time to talk to each other. They get to know each other, they ask about their families, and then they start talking about what they would have liked to be if they actually had the chance to do it. And it's fascinating. And then you begin to think about, well, what kind of society would we need if that could actually happen? So I'm concerned, so I'm trying to emphasize that we really develop this vision through struggle. And the other thing is that a lot of people, when you give them a vision, they say, well, that's not possible, that's not human nature. And it's true, it's not human nature under capitalism. That's the problem with capitalism. And so they don't believe you. And they only begin to believe it when they see themselves changing. And when they're in struggle, they begin to change, and then begin to see, well, it is possible to change ourselves. Because a big part of change isn't just transforming institutions, it's transforming ourselves. That's the most important part. We have to transform ourselves so we can transform institutions. So this question of vision, I guess, my vision of it is that we need a society in which the development of our capacities is a mutual question. The development of my capacities actually depends on the development of your capacities, because that adds things and adds possibilities. And to have that kind of society, you can't have it in a world of private property. You can't have it in the world of people selling their labor. So it implies a lot of things. It means that there has to be democratic control over workplaces, democratic controls over our community, and that means developing democratic capacities, which are also quite difficult. Just developing this capacity that you don't really experience, and it only also comes from experience. You have to practice democracy to learn it. So you begin to imagine, a world where there's these democratic capacities, and then there's the complexities of, okay, I can imagine it, my local, but how do we create structures? So you have to have some kind of representational democracy in addition to direct democracy. I think of it in those general ways. Now, you can fill it out with all kinds of things we like. The bank should be nationalized. We should have plans for conversion. You'd want a different kind of urban environment. And you can imagine, people have done great thinking about how the urban environment could be different. But I see it as kind of dialectical, that we would try things and be very experimental. But we wouldn't have those barriers. I mean, I think the real barrier to human development today is capitalism. That's the problem. And if you can get rid of it, it's not going to be wonderful, but we can start experimenting and learning and trying things. And, I think that's exciting. And then I think it becomes more meaningful to actually, as you're in struggle, to have these kinds of discussions. Okay, you go for a beer. Okay, how would we solve this problem? And you start naming all these real problems. And people are quite creative in figuring out how to do it. Okay?
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate it.
Good.